What's up, Meta Nerds? In this video, we'll be pulling from every resource that has come out over the decades, taking a deep dive into the origins, design, and legacy of the R2 series. We'll explore how they built upon earlier droid models, the innovations that set them apart, comparisons with other astromech lines, like the quirky C1 that gave us Chopper, as well as other R units, and the roles they played from the days of the Old Republic through the Clone Wars, Rebellion, New Republic, and beyond. By the end, you'll see why the R2 unit, epitomized by the legendary R2-D2, remains one of the most iconic droids in galactic history. Long before the first R2 unit ever beeped, the galaxy was experimenting with automated mechanics for starships. Astromech-like droids had existed for millennia. As far back as the Old Republic era, thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin, spacer crews employed utility droids to assist in navigation and repairs. One of the most famous was the T3 series utility droid, produced by Dewani Mechanical Products, introduced prior to the Great Droid Revolution, around 4015 BBY. These boxy little T3 units, like the famous T3M4 that served Revan, they could slice computers and even wield blasters. And they remained popular for over a century, and represent a primitive ancestor of the later astromechs. But early utility droids like the T3 were still limited in scope. The concept of a dedicated astromech droid, one designed specifically to navigate hyperspace in 10 starships, truly began to crystallize in the last few centuries of the Republic. The first true astromech came with Industrial Automaton's P2 series. IA, a company that was formed from a merger in 32 BBY on Nubia, pioneered astromech droid development. Their P2 astromech was the galaxy's first dedicated astromech droid, initially sold exclusively to the Republic's fleets. It bore many of the hallmarks that would become standard: a cylindrical body packed with tools and a semi-domed head for sensor displays. The spacefaring community welcomed the P2's ability to perform quick repairs and navigational calculations, functions that proved extremely useful on small ships, which were without full-time technicians. But due to legal contracts, the P2 units were restricted to Republic use and never hit the broader market. This setback only drove IA's engineers to innovate further. Around the same time, they experimented with a line known as the C-series astromechs, which starts at the C1. The C1 astromechs were deployed during the late Republic era, around the Clone Wars period of 22 to 19 BBY, and even served the Grand Army of the Republic. These can be thought of as a missing link between the primitive P2 and the breakthrough R2. Like their successors, C1 units featured a cylindrical chassis with a rotating domed head, 3 wheeled legs for locomotion, and an assortment of manipulator arms. C110P, better known as Chopper, is a surviving example of this line, a crotchety but loyal little droid who served aboard the rebel freighter Ghost decades later. C1 units had basic repair tools like an arc welder and could assist in piloting and navigation, but they were technologically simpler than the later R-series models. The C1's programming wasn't as sophisticated in mechanics or personality, and they could fly and fix ships in a rudimentary fashion, but lacked the clever problem-solving subroutines that would come later. And most important is that these C1 droids used somewhat tolerant, rugged components that allowed mechanics to jury-rig them in all manner of spare parts. That's one reason why Chopper, this Clone Wars era relic, managed to stay operational into the Rebellion years. He was constantly patched together from mismatched parts, and yet he kept rolling. By around 0 BBY, C1 astromechs were considered antiques past the manufacturer's expiry date. So while the C1 came out before the R2, it was of a different series. And so let's look at the R1, which was a very different type of beast, and you can see why in style the R2 is based more off of the C1 than the R1. This was Industrial Automaton's first entry into the commercial astromech arena, and it came out around the same time as the P2 and C1, just before 32 BBY. If you ever see an R1 unit, you might be struck by how un-astromech-like it appears. Unlike the knee-high R2 with its cute dome, the R1 was a towering machine nearly 2 meters tall, built from the black, heavy-duty body shell of a reactor maintenance droid. The R1 was essentially a repurposed reactor drone. Its cylindrical body was heavily shielded to work around Starship reactor cores. It trundled around on a single treaded unipod wheel and was notoriously slow and clunky. These early R1s were usually stationed on capital ships and large freighters where their bulk wasn't a problem, just attending to a reactor, and they're not getting in the way of anybody because nobody else should be down there. From a technological level, the R1 was a significant improvement over the P2 prototype. It carried an Intel X3 computer brain loaded with navigational data for 500 different Starship configurations, which was by far the leader when it came out. The R1 was the first astromech model capable of calculating hyperspace coordinates, allowing a ship to make at least a single jump without external navicomputer assistance. The R1 also sported an array of retractable tools to perform onboard repairs, and it could communicate in the binary language droid speak to interface with ship systems and other droids. These capabilities earned the R1 the moniker astromech reactor drone, as it could do a little maintenance and navigation. Yet for all its advancements, the R1 had glaring shortcomings. Its ungainly unipod wheel was prone to breakdowns. Many an R1 owner found their droid literally stuck in place when the single tread malfunctioned. And while later R units would be known for their cheerful personalities, the R1's demeanor left much to be desired. They tended to be, quote, obstinate and surly, as contemporary reports say. Regular memory wipes are recommended to curb these attitude problems. Unfortunately, those frequent wipes had a side effect. The droids never got a chance to familiarize themselves with the ships they served, reducing their effectiveness over time. It became a vicious cycle of a cranky droid, memory wipe, lost experience, and a frustrated owner. Customers complained about the R1's temperament and reliability, all valid gripes, since this was supposed to be a tool to make the pilot's life easier. Now they just had an unreliable, grumpy chore to deal with. Industrial Automaton took this feedback to heart, promising that the next model would fix these flaws. And despite all these flaws, it still had a wide distribution, being seen in Watto's shop and being hawked by the Jawa traders on the Lars homestead. The R1's moderate success paved the way for Industrial Automaton's truly revolutionary design. The company went back to the drawing board to create a smarter, smaller, and friendlier astromech, and the results would change galactic history. In the decades leading up to the Clone Wars, IA unveiled the R-Series astromech droid, a marvel of miniaturization and intelligent design. If the R1 was a lumbering giant, the R2 was a nimble dwarf, and a genius one at that, standing about 1.08 meters tall on its trio of wheeled legs. The R2 series was compact enough to fit in a starfighter's droid socket, yet packed with more tools and tech than its predecessors. It far surpassed the R1 in every category and quickly became the gold standard for astromechs. There was a versatile suite of equipment. Engineers managed to cram in a navicomputer memory capable of storing astronavigation data for 700 Starship configurations, a 40% increase over R1's, meaning it could get you through hyperspace whether placed in a nimble fighter or light freighter, making it an invaluable co-pilot for spacers of all stripes. The sensor package on the R2 was equally impressive, boasting full spectrum scanners, electromagnetic, heat, motion, etc., and even life form sensors for detecting biological presences. Essentially, an R2 could see and hear the world in ways organics couldn't, picking up on heat signatures behind a bulkhead to sensing movement in total darkness. They're using all this to see through a ship and hopefully identify what's wrong and know how to fix it. Most famously, they came equipped with a Swiss Army knife assortment of tools tucked into panels around its midsection. The designers worked with countless spacers, and they made sure it was built for all environments and emergencies, and it shows. A standard R2 unit might carry extendable armatures for welding, cutting, and grabbing, an electric arc zap pod for self-defense or jump-starting machinery, a fusion cutter for slicing through panels, a computer S-Comp link arm, which could interface with almost any computer system, diagnostic sensors for troubleshooting ship systems, and even quirky accessories like an internal fire extinguisher to douse onboard blazes. And R2-D2 himself famously deployed a periscope when submerged in a swamp, a buzzsaw blade to cut nets, and even rocket boosters to fly short distances, showing the modular potential of this design. The head featured a primary photoreceptor eye and holographic projectors, which could come in handy when you have to save the galaxy. So the R2 was a self-contained Starship maintenance bay and astrogation office, all rolled into one friendly package. Because what truly set the R2 apart was its brain and personality. IA focused on developing the droid's persona alongside its hardware. The R2's droid brain, an Intel X4 or 5 models in various subspecies, was programmed to be cooperative, curious, and even empathetic. This was a deliberate strategy. By giving R2 units a compassionate and helpful disposition, IA found that owners were far less inclined to memory wipe them regularly. Whereas grumpy R1s got wiped every few months and would cause them to lose any knowledge they had about the quirks of their particular ship, R2 droids often went years or longer without a memory wipe, accumulating knowledge and expertise that made them even more effective. Instead of that negative feedback loop, you have a positive feedback loop. The droids get smarter and develop their own unique personality, and the owner hopefully just keeps growing more and more fond of it. This is of course what happened with the most famous R2 of all, R2-D2, who never received a full memory wipe in his decades of service, which is absolutely unheard of for any droid. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, R2-D2 had an independent attitude, along with a wealth of experience, and it's no exaggeration to say that the R2 series took the galaxy by storm. Upon its debut, it became immensely popular among pilots, mechanics, and even smugglers who appreciated a reliable partner in crime. It can be a lonely profession. Starfighter corps from Naboo to Coruscant stocked up on the R2 units to serve as onboard astrogators and technicians, and Anakin would of course trust his life to R2-D2 multiple times throughout the Clone Wars. It was so beloved by the time of the Clone Wars that there were even some urban legends that developed around them. Some claim that R2s had been around for over a century, claiming to spot their ancestors all over the galaxy, and that they may have been secretly involved in major events throughout history. That doesn't seem to be true, but the Force does work in mysterious ways. Perhaps history has been guided by these little astromechs. Ubiquitous, inconspicuous, maybe there are little robotic guardian angels intervening at key moments to make sure that the light side wins. What we do know for certain is that R2's introduction had a paradigm-shifting effect on Starship operations. It made it so that an astromech socket became standard on starfighters. These round droid slots you see on craft like the Incom T-65 X-Wing or Naboo N-1 Starfighter show that this one product was so ubiquitous that other starfighter companies had to make sure that they accounted for it. The R2's form factor and interface protocols set the template that many future astromech droids, and the ships that needed them, would follow. Thanks to the R2, it became normal for a single-seat fighter to carry an autonomous co-pilot that could calculate hyperjump coordinates, manage deflector shields, and effect emergency repairs. This extended the range and survivability of fighters dramatically. The Republic Navy in the Clone Wars and later the Rebel Alliance capitalized on this. Their pilots could undertake longer, riskier missions with trusty R2 units keeping the ship running and piloting escape routes when needed. Technologically, it pushed the boundaries of power efficiency and durability. They are built to withstand the harshest environments, from the vacuum of space, where they could affix themselves to starfighter hulls, to swampy bogs and desert heat. Sealed casings and adjustable mood LEDs aside, an R2 could survive depressurization, direct hits from debris, and ion storms that would fry lesser droids. Many R2s also featured amphibious adaptations. With some minor tweaks, they could operate underwater, as R2-D2 demonstrated on Dagobah and Naboo. Their compact fusion power core and battery systems were marvels of engineering, allowing all those gadgets, the computer probe, sensors, motors, etc., to run off a small internal reactor safely. One anecdotal flaw in the R2 design, humorously noted by older model droids, was that R2 units could be too compassionate. Chopper once said that R2's biggest programming flaw was its tendency toward empathy. And of course, they do form loyal bonds with their owners and exhibit concern over other living beings. Like I said, this was designed on purpose, being more like pets or a friend than simple equipment. And this empathy would go both ways, as these were some of the most widespread droids in the entire galaxy. Even if they just spoke in beeps and boops, many people would feel a real sense of connection with their astromechs, often even more than something like a protocol droid, which might look more human and speak your language, but there was something missing, something that comes close to a sort of soul. And so these feelings toward the astromech may have at least played a part in the rise of the droid rights movement around the same time. As countless droid types around the galaxy were feeling a sense of self, going longer and longer without these memory wipes, and while the majority might have still seen them as less than organics, there was still a rising sentiment amongst organics that you could actually be mean to a droid. They could suffer or enjoy life, and with that, the droid walks or rolls onto the moral landscape. It can't simply be a tool if there's some right and wrong way to treat it. And so it may have sparked this whole philosophical movement, but of course it also inspired future entries into the R-series line. We have from R1 up to at least R9 spreading out over the decades. And of course, many other manufacturers tried their hand at astro droids with mixed results. So let's see how the R2 compares to its siblings and rivals. First up, the R3 series. Superficially, it looks like an R2 with a transparent dome, but under the hood it was tuned for military and government use. It came out not long after the R2 and featured an upgraded Intel X5 processor, giving it faster data crunching for complex tasks. It also carried immense data storage, essentially acting as a roving computer database, and this made R3 units ideal for managing large facility networks. That's why they were used on Imperial battle stations. But they cost more, and their clear Plastex domes were more for aesthetics than function. For everyday starfighter use, most pilots still preferred the balanced, personable R2. So the R3 is a brainier specialist astromech, less common but valued in roles where sheer computing power was needed. The R4 took a different approach: budget friendliness and rugged simplicity. Introduced during the Clone Wars, the R4 series was designed for use in the Outer Rim and by less affluent customers. Many R4 units came with a conical spire dome instead of the classic bubble dome. And in their technology, they were like stripped down R2s. They removed certain high-end features to lower the cost, and they were marketed for anti-grav vehicles and other civilian craft rather than frontline military fighters. One of the most famous variants was the R4P series, which had just the domed head of an R4 integrated directly into a starfighter, seen in the Delta 7. Because the Delta 7 was too long to fit a whole astromech body, engineers fixed an R4P unit's head into the wing, essentially creating a built-in astromech brain for the fighter. For the standalone R4 units, their lower price made them popular with traders and explorers on a budget, and they could handle basic hyperspace jumps and repairs. But they lacked some of the R2's finesse, fewer gadget arms and sensors, and so they weren't quite as universally adopted. If the R4 was a modest success, the R5 series was IA's big misstep. The R5 was meant to be a cut-rate astromech for the masses, essentially an even cheaper R2, but it had a squatter, boxier body and a flat-topped head. While the R5 retained the essential astromech functions like navigation and some basic repair tools, almost every component was built to lower specifications, and the result was that R5s were notoriously unreliable. They had a tendency to suffer mechanical failures, in some cases even develop bad attitudes and obstinate personalities. As if whatever that emergent droid personality or soul is, it was resentful of their shoddy construction. The joke in maintenance bays was that R5 stood for really faulty, and the most famous incident involving an R5 unit was on Tatooine, when R5D4's motivator blew out at the worst moment, or of course as the Force willed it, the best moment, forcing a certain moisture farmer to choose R2D2 instead. But facing mounting complaints and returns, IA pulled the R5 from the market relatively quickly in order to save face. And the R5's legacy is mostly a cautionary tale. Penny pinching on an astromech is not worth it. Though it did just work to prove how excellent the R2 design was, it really was worth the credits. After the Empire's fall in 4 ABY, IA went back to making premium astromechs for the New Republic and beyond. The R6 series, released shortly after the Battle of Endor, was essentially a modernized R2 made with New Republic tech advances. R6 units had the friendly programming of an R2, a similar cylindrical shape, though actually still using some of R5's cheaper but sturdy shell materials, plus updated storage and more tool mounts. It was a next-gen R2, and without those Imperial-era cutting of corners. A very solid droid that found favor among New Republic pilots. The R7 was a specialized offshoot developed to interface with the new E-Wing starfighter. E-Wings could only use R7 astromechs at first, making these droids effectively exclusive accessories to that fighter, and they had more advanced systems for targeting and ship integration. But outside of an E-Wing, they weren't notably better than an R6 or R2. In fact, this one-to-one pairing hurt the E-Wing program initially. If the R7 had a hiccup, then your starfighter was grounded, and you couldn't just swap it out with a much more ubiquitous R6 or R2. Later, E-Wing models were refitted to accept standard astromechs for flexibility. The R8 and R9 series continued the lineage further into the future. The R8 unit incorporated a few design tweaks like a disc-shaped sensor instead of the traditional radar eye, and was made to be more adaptable to different starfighter types than the overly specific R7. The R9 series, the last known in the line, was described as being similar to the R2 but with enhanced systems and processing. Essentially the culmination of everything learned from the previous models. By the time the R9 units rolled out, astromechs had become so entrenched in Starship design that the galaxy couldn't imagine flying without them. Though throughout all these iterations, none of these later models ever quite eclipsed the success of the R2. Everything was always compared to the R2. And a few other companies' astromech lines achieved wide use during R2's reign. There were specialized droids like Surosub's FA-5 pilot droid, a lanky automaton that could fly a ship but wasn't an astromech per se, and there were a myriad of maintenance droids like the Gonks and PK series, but those filled more specialized roles. One interesting competitor was the Q7 series astromech, a spherical hover droid deployed late in the Clone Wars for aerospace fighters. Q7 did away with the wheels and used repulsor lifts instead, predating the later BB series spherical droids by decades. While the idea of a ball-shaped astromech that could float into a starfighter was novel, the Q7 had drawbacks. Repulsors were expensive to maintain, and if they failed, the droid literally had no legs to stand on. The Empire, with its love for cutting costs, did not adopt the Q7 widely. Ultimately, IA's R-Series held a near monopoly on astromechs throughout the Republic and Imperial periods. The BB series would emerge much later, around 34 ABY, and they were next-generation droids that abandoned the R-Series tri-legged form for a rolling spherical body. Industrial Automaton began developing the BB series as early as the last years of the Republic, in 34 BBY, envisioning a totally different approach to Starship droids, which really shows how great this company is, that even when the R2 was dominating, they were thinking about the future. It's essentially a domed head perched atop a free-rolling ball chassis, giving it extreme agility and the ability to traverse difficult terrain. It was IA's first major departure from the paradigm established by the R2. But even with this latest iteration, it is a continuation of an entire system that the R2 established, as many of the Starship sockets and other interfaces across countless ships in the galaxy all became the norm in order to accommodate the R2, and then everything else has to fall in line to match that. And as one of the most common spacer phrases went, thank the maker for the R2s. We'd be lost in space without them. They trusted in these machines, developed a real love for these quirky droids who in no way speak like us or share our anatomical form, and yet they became one of the most personable droids out there, being trusted co-pilots and even friends, to the point that they shaped the physical design of starships from then on out, and even reshaped the moral landscape in a galaxy where organics and droids live together. That's it for its breakdown. I'll eventually do a whole complete life video on just R2-D2. This droid has one of the longest and most impactful character stories. But for the R2 series in general, if you want to learn more, check out the New Essential Guide to Droids and Star Wars Blueprints. But most important of all, remember, if we don't know how consciousness emerged, we might be surprised by where we see it emerge. And the Force will be with you, always.